know, students, is the first question has to come from you. So don't wait for your professors to do the heavy lifting. You be thinking, the wheels should be turning as you're listening. What questions are sparking my mind? What do I want to know more about? What do I want clarified? And then raise that hand and wait for the microphone, and off you go. After the talk, 4:46, there's a reception right next door in the great room, some great meatless, Lenten but not at all penitential hors d'oeuvres being served. Please join us there to continue the conversation. The last thing I would urge you is to take those beautiful, sleek screens of yours and close them down. If you're like, Dr. Bernhoff, what if I don't have the talk memorized? I'll post a recording by Monday or Tuesday of next week. And so if you need to go back and get anything, you got it there. With that being said, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Father Isaac.
Thank you, Ian. It's my pleasure, on behalf of the C.S. Lewis Fellowship, to welcome Dr. Holly Ordway. In case you do not know what the C.S. Lewis Fellowship is, it's a program that was started about a year ago under the auspices of the Humanities Program, whose goal is to promote the teaching of C.S. Lewis. I'm delighted to welcome Holly Ordway to Providence College. Holly is the Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute, as well as visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts and is a subject editor for the Journal of Inkling Studies. She is the author of the award-winning Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. And a few years ago, during the dark times, she appeared on a screen at PC, but we're happy to have her in person this year. She has also contributed chapters on Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and the Inklings to volumes such as C.S. Lewis and Poets' Corner, The Inklings and King Arthur, and C.S. Lewis's List. Her most recent book is titled Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography, and I just dropped her talk on the floor. It's an excellent book. It came out last September in time for the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death. And Dr. Ordway will be speaking us today on the topic of faith, friendship, and fantasy, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis's mutual influence. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ordway.
Is it working? Is it working? Yes, I think it's working. Excellent. Technology. This is good. When it works, it's great. When it doesn't work, well, not so great. But it's working. This is all good. Good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is really lovely to be here in person here at Providence College to talk about my two favorite authors. Now, the friendship between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien is probably one of the most significant in literary history. It was transformative for both men. And in fact, if they had never met, it's entirely possible, even probable, that we wouldn't know about either of them today, and I wouldn't be here talking to you. If Tolkien had not become friends with Lewis, then The Lord of the Rings would never have been finished, let alone published. As Tolkien put it years later, but for his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. And now, given how much of Tolkien's output actually did remain unfinished and unpublished at his death, millions of words of it, this scenario is all too plausible. We might not have had The Lord of the Rings. And conversely, without Tolkien, Lewis quite possibly would not have become a Christian, or he wouldn't have done it during this pivotal stage in his life, with his literary career ahead of him. And so we wouldn't have had things like Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters, and the Chronicles of Narnia. As Lewis recalled, Tolkien gave him much help in getting over the last stile, the last obstacle of his conversion. Now, their friendship has become so famous that there are two different, very different, almost opposite misconceptions about it. On the one hand, because they have so much in common, they're fellow members of the group known as the Inklings, they're both academics at Oxford, both Christians, both writers of fantasy, it's easy to take their friendship for granted. And it's easy, in fact, to kind of blur them together into a sort of composite Tol-Lewis sort of figure. But on the other side, there's a sort of urban legend that floats around in memes and things that says that they had a falling out, that they had a sort of friendship breakup, or that they were in conflict because Tolkien allegedly hated Narnia so much, which he didn't, or that he was jealous of Lewis, which he wasn't. So there's a lot that could be said about the very rich topic of their friendship. But what I want to do this afternoon is to just explore a couple of aspects of this very complex, very interesting friendship, mainly in terms of their spiritual lives. And so along the way, I hope that we'll set those two misconceptions to rights, and we'll see in reality that the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien was deep-rooted and enduring, despite many differences between them. Professional differences, temperamental differences, spiritual differences, and also how this friendship had a profound influence on each of them. The first thing to note is that Lewis was an Anglican, a member of the Church of England. Tolkien was a Catholic, a member of what was at that time not only a minority faith, but one that was culturally, socially, and economically marginalized. And so their friendship was an ecumenical friendship. Though they had deep differences about particular doctrines, they shared the core elements of Christianity through their baptism and their profession of faith in Christ. Ecumenism is the promotion of the restoration of unity among all Christians. And it meant in their friendship that although they disagreed on key points, each man recognized that the other was a Christian, a follower of Jesus Christ. In hindsight, this ecumenical quality of their friendship seems almost obvious. After all, Lewis went on to write Mere Christianity, in the preface to which he says, "Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times." And again, in hindsight, we can look back at the gatherings of the Inklings, which had both Anglicans and Catholics meeting and conversing, for the most part in harmony. And we can look at Tolkien's happy gift of friendship with Lewis and with many other Anglicans. And we might think that calling attention to the ecumenical nature of their friendship is like saying it was an Oxonian friendship or a literary friendship. What's the big deal? But if we look at the cultural and social conditions that when the two men met in 1926, we can see that there were barriers that could easily have prevented their friendship from even getting started. In Tolkien's day and Lewis's day, the differences between Catholics and Anglicans were much more keenly felt. Lewis, although he had abandoned his childhood faith and was still an atheist at the time that he met Tolkien, had grown up in Northern Ireland, where anti-Catholic sentiment remained widespread, overt, and strong. As he put it in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, "At my first coming into the world, I had been implicitly warned never to trust a papist. And at my first coming into the English faculty, explicitly never to trust a philologist." Tolkien was both. Now, seen from hindsight, this observation can appear just humorous, exaggerated. And certainly there is an element of humor here, but it's a humor about a very real prejudice. Lewis's early upbringing might easily have made him disinclined to become friends with a papist. He'd been conditioned as a child to mistrust those wicked Romanists. So why should he spend time with Tolkien when there were so many other interesting people in Oxford? And his diary entry from when he met Tolkien at an English faculty meeting in 1926 shows that his first impression of Tolkien, although not exactly negative, was not particularly warm. He is a smooth, pale, fluent little chap. No harm in him, only needs a smack or so. Well, what about Tolkien? At that time, English Catholics were socially and economically marginalized as a group. And this is a legacy from the Reformation in England. Civic disabilities for Catholics had lasted long after the harsh penal laws had ceased to be enforced. Catholics were only allowed to vote in 1829. Until 1854, Oxford University did not allow Catholics to matriculate. And it was only in 1871, by Act of Parliament, that all the barriers were finally removed to Catholics earning university degrees or holding university positions. Legal discrimination against Catholics persisted well into Tolkien's adult life. The last of the penal laws were not removed until 1926. And generations of exclusion had an effect. When Tolkien matriculated at Exeter College in Oxford in 1911, he was part of a tiny minority, only 4% of the student body. In 1925, when he came back to Oxford to take up the Rawlinson and Bosworth Chair of Anglo-Saxon, he was one of only 4 Catholics to hold full professorial chairs at the university. And each one of those 4 was the first Catholic to have held that chair since the Reformation. So it's not surprising that many Catholics of that era were inward-looking, wary of Anglicans, or even hostile to them. And for Tolkien, it wouldn't have been surprising if Lewis's Ulster Protestant background was an extra red flag. So we can see that on both sides, the friendship might have died before it even started. But that's not what happened. As the 1930s unfolded, the two men grew closer and closer, sparking ideas off of each other. As a friend remarked, they were like 2 young bear cubs sometimes, just happily quipping with one another. Now, this friendship didn't come out of nowhere. It grew over time. In 1926, Tolkien and Lewis had just met, but as we saw, they didn't seem to have a lot in common. But then Tolkien started a club called the Coal-Biters to read Norse sagas in the original Icelandic, as one does. So Lewis joined, and then Tolkien therefore discovered that they had shared literary interests. And then later, as they got to know each other a bit better, Tolkien took a real risk. He showed Lewis the draft of a poem that he was working on, the Lay of Leithian, about the love of Beren, a human man, and Luthien, an elvish princess. Lewis's response was warm. I can quite honestly say that it is ages since I have had an evening of such delight, and the personal interest of reading a friend's work had very little to do with it. I should have enjoyed it just as well if I'd picked it up in a bookshop by an unknown author. The two things that come out clearly are the sense of reality in the background and the mythical value, the essence of a myth being that it should have no taint of allegory to the maker, and yet should suggest incipient allegories to the reader. Lewis also wrote a detailed commentary and critique, and he did it in a way that was perfectly suited to Tolkien's very sensitive nature. So Lewis took the conceit that the poem was an ancient text being critiqued by 4 different scholars. He even gave them names: Peabody, Pumpernickel, Schuffer, and Schick. And he has these 4 scholars arguing over the authentic reading of the manuscript. And so that way, Lewis could take the sting out of some of his remarks that are otherwise fairly critical, as when he has one of his scholars comment, many scholars have rejected lines 1 through 8 altogether as unworthy of the poet. So he offers this criticism to Tolkien, and Tolkien accepted it gratefully, and he even made many changes to the text using Lewis's feedback. Now, as it happened, he never actually finished the Lay of Leithian. This is Tolkien, but this exchange had an immediate positive effect. It greatly strengthened their friendship. And this deepening friendship had a wider effect, influencing many others. The Inklings coalesced around Lewis and Tolkien. The group was comprised mostly of Anglicans, but it also included a number of Catholics, such as Robert Havard, Gervase Matthew, Jim Dundas Grant, Colin Hardy, and J.A.W. Bennett. Now, to be sure, Hugo Dyson, one of the Inklings, once said, more or less jokingly, he would resign his membership in the group if any more Catholics joined. And he eventually became a source of real difficulty in the group's cohesion. But despite Dyson's interference, the group was remarkably ecumenical. Because it had grown in large part out of the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien, there was never a sense that Catholics were merely tolerated. Lewis's mere Christian mindset made ecclesiological matters questions of secondary importance. And given that he was basically the chairman of the group, his attitude on these matters was really decisive for the tone of the meetings. Sparks could fly, sparks did fly between Catholics and Anglicans, but Lewis never allowed disputes to destroy their collective understanding of themselves as being united in their adherence to the Christian faith. Now, it was not all smooth sailing, either in the Inklings or in the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien. After Lewis died, Tolkien commented to his son Michael that he and Lewis had ceased to be intimates in the previous 10 years. Sometimes this is taken as indicating that there was a rift or a falling out between the two men, but this wasn't the view of those who knew them best. As Tolkien's daughter Priscilla noted, in the late 1950s and into the 1960s, they experienced a loosening of the bonds and a loss of what my father would call the communion between them. But, she says, the affection remained. And his son Christopher concurred, noting that it was no more than a drifting apart. It's sometimes said that Tolkien was jealous of Lewis's friendship with one of the newer members of the Inklings, Charles Williams, but I haven't found any indication that that was the case. What did hurt Tolkien, and not unreasonably, was when Lewis got married and didn't tell him about it. Lewis found out about it through somebody else a year after the fact. And to add to that, Tolkien had concerns about what seemed to him, and seemed to many of his friends, many of Lewis's friends, a very odd marriage to a divorced American who had sort of rolled into Oxford and apparently kind of swept Lewis up. So I think it's actually a testament to the strength of their friendship that it survived this testing episode in their lives. But also, in the 1950s and the 1960s, both men were just very busy. Tolkien was at that point the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature, and Lewis, in 1954, took up the chair of Medieval and Renaissance English at Cambridge, which was a position that Tolkien had actually worked very hard to secure for him. Both of them were writing books. Tolkien had grandchildren by then, so further occupying his time. And so it's not surprising that they just didn't spend as much time with each other as they had in earlier years. When Lewis died in 1963, at the relatively early age of 64, Tolkien was devastated. He said that it feels like an axe blow near the roots. He had a mass said for Lewis and served at it. And later that day, he attended Lewis's funeral at the Anglican Church of Holy Trinity, Headington Quarry. Walter Hooper, Lewis's friend and literary executor, visited Tolkien soon after Lewis's death. And Hooper recalled that one of the points that Tolkien made was that Lewis had not made enough time for me. And Walter says, I explained that Lewis's view was that Tolkien had not made enough time for him. I think he felt then that it was a pity that they had both claimed to be very busy, which they doubtless were, but you just don't really believe your friends will die. Friends they were, and friends they remained. As Tolkien himself reflected, we owed each a great debt to the other, and that tie, with the deep affection that it begot, remains. Their friendship received one last test in 1964, the year after Lewis died, when Lewis's final book appeared in print. Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, is structured around the conceit of a series of letters to Malcolm, who's a fictional character invented to allow Lewis to discuss this topic in a colloquial, informal manner. It is, on the whole, a wise, insightful book, and it contains quite a lot that Tolkien could and undoubtedly did approve of and agree with. Yet, when Tolkien read it, he was also dismayed. He wrote to a Catholic correspondent that I personally found Letters to Malcolm a distressing and in parts horrifying work. I began a commentary on it, but if finished, it would not be publishable. There are a few points in Letters to Malcolm that undoubtedly irritated Tolkien, but what certainly distressed him on a deep level was Lewis's discussion of transubstantiation, Catholic doctrine that the bread and wine of the altar become, when consecrated, the body and blood of Christ. Lewis, very uncharacteristically, says that he can't imagine and can't think what this could mean. And this is extremely incomprehensible for Lewis, who had this tremendously flexible and vibrant imagination. And to Tolkien, for whom the Blessed Sacrament was, as he put it, the one great thing to love on earth, it would have felt that to him, that Lewis was being dismissive of the central mystery of his faith. And so with this in mind, we can better understand how it is that Tolkien's commentary on Letters to Malcolm quickly shifted into a consideration of Lewis himself and how Tolkien felt that Lewis had been affected by the anti-Catholicism of his upbringing in Ulster. But as it happens, Lewis was himself remarkably aware and self-critical of his ulterior tendencies. One of Lewis's Catholic friends, the Jesuit priest Father Guy Brinkworth, recalled that Lewis asked him for prayers that the prejudices instilled in me by an Ulster nurse might be overcome. There's no evidence that Lewis ever seriously considered becoming a Catholic, but he certainly strove against his own prejudices to achieve a charitable attitude towards his fellow Christians in the Church of Rome. And in fact, Tolkien understood this. He vented his grief and his anger in his private commentary, but this does not comprise the whole of his reaction to Letters to Malcolm. In the margins of his copy, he adds an affectionate note. But the whole book is always interesting. Why? Because it is about Jack by Jack, and that is a topic that no one who knew him well could fail to find interesting, even when exasperating. And it's this more measured tone that we find a few months later in Tolkien's comments on an article about Lewis. He observed that Lewis, of course, had some oddities and could sometimes be irritating. He was, after all, and remained an Irishman of Ulster. But, Tolkien said, he was generous-minded and on guard against all prejudices, though a few were too deep-rooted in his native background to be observed by him. The effects of Lewis's early upbringing in an anti-Catholic environment may never have entirely disappeared, but as Lewis himself remarked, his friendship with Tolkien marked the breakdown of two old prejudices against philologists and against Catholics. And Tolkien, although he undoubtedly wished that Lewis had become a Catholic, was perfectly clear that Lewis was a Christian, even if not fully in the one fold of the Catholic Church. In the same letter in which Tolkien affirms his own fidelity to the Catholic Church, he adds, God cannot be limited and may use any channel for his grace. Even to love our Lord, and certainly to call him Lord and God, is a grace, and may bring more grace. And it's this view that allowed him to have a deep spiritual friendship, as well as a warm social connection with non-Catholics like Lewis. So now that we've had an overview of their friendship, I want us now to consider the way that they influenced each other. So let's go back to 1926, when the two men met and became friends. Lewis, at this time, was gradually moving toward belief in God. He'd become an atheist, he had rejected his childhood faith, but now he was gradually moving toward faith in God, partly through philosophical engagement with the idea of objective value, and partly through his steadily advancing friendship with Tolkien. Lewis recorded that on one occasion they sat discoursing of the gods and giants in Asgard for 3 hours. The fire was bright and the talk good. They went on until 2:30 in the morning. The most significant of these nighttime conversations occurred in September 1931. Tolkien joined Lewis and his visiting friend Hugo Dyson for an evening at Magdalen College. Dyson was an Anglican. Lewis was a newly minted theist, a believer in God, but not yet a Christian. After dinner, the three men took a stroll around Addison's Walk, a beautiful tree-lined path circling parkland where the college's fallow deer roam. They began with conversations about myth and metaphor, and then they turned to the topic of Christianity. A week after this conversation, Lewis wrote to a friend that he had passed on from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ, in Christianity. My long night talk with Dyson and Tolkien had a good deal to do with it. Lewis's problem with Christianity at this point had to do with his inability to grasp the meaning of certain Christian doctrines. As he put it, in what sense the life and death of Christ saved or opened salvation to the world? The theological expressions of this mystery, such as sacrifice or the blood of the lamb, seemed to him either silly or shocking. Now, Lewis was focusing intellectually upon doctrines and finding that they left him cold. As he explained to his friend Arthur Greaves, now what Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this, that if I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. Again, that if I met the idea of a god sacrificing himself to himself, I liked it very much and was mysteriously moved by it. Again, that the idea of the dying and reviving god, Balder, Adonis, Bacchus, similarly moved me, provided I met it anywhere except in the Gospels. The reason was that in the pagan stories, I was prepared to feel the myth as profound and suggestive of meaning beyond my grasp, even though I could not say in cold prose what it meant. The irony was that Lewis already knew very well that myths could not be adequately rendered in cold prose. We saw from his response to Tolkien's poem The Lay of Lathian that he understood that myths are different from allegories. But his approach to Christianity at that point was basically allegorical, not mythical. That is, Lewis was trying to understand the faith by translating it into another set of terms, a doctrinal, intellectual, systematic language. But as his talk with Tolkien and Dyson progressed, Lewis began to see that Christianity was primarily a story, not a system of thought, and that it had to be approached with the same imaginative embrace that enabled him to enjoy myths in general. The tremendous difference, Lewis realized, was that the Christian story was historical. It was a true myth. Indeed, it was the true myth. It really happened. As Lewis acknowledged within days of this life-changing conversation, the doctrines we get out of the true myth are, of course, less true. They are translations into our concepts and ideas of that which God has already expressed in a language more adequate, namely the actual incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. Tolkien and Dyson helped him to see that Christianity was a series of events that shone by its own light. Doctrinal expressions had their use, but they were secondary and derivative. The thing that had to be believed was not contrary to reason, but it was opaque to reason in the sense that it can't be explained better in any other terms. One can't see through the story to some other, more fundamental explanatory framework. The specifics that Dyson contributed to the conversation are lost to history, but the way that Tolkien helped to shape Lewis's perspective comes across in Mythopoeia, the poem he wrote soon after their Addison's Walk conversation. It's in print only in the UK edition of Tree and Leaf, As a result, it's sadly overlooked, but it's an important poem and a very good poem. Mythopoeia is subtitled Philomythos to Mesomythos, that is, from lover of myths, Tolkien, to hater of myths, Lewis. And it opens by describing a way of looking at the world as a mere aggregate of objects to be named and categorized, but without real intrinsic value, sort of materialistic view of the world. You look at trees and label them just so, for trees are trees and growing is to grow. You walk the earth and tread with solemn pace one of the many minor globes of space. A star's a star, some matter in a ball, compelled to courses mathematical, amid the regimented, cold, inane, where destined atoms are each moment slain. But this flat materialist view, Tolkien says, is an inadequate understanding of the world. He sees no stars, who does not see them first of living silver made, that sudden burst of flame like flowers beneath an ancient song, whose very echo after music long has since pursued. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tent myth-woven and elf-patterned, and no earth, unless the mother's womb whence all have birth. One can't be said really to see the stars without seeing them as living silver, and outer space is only a void unless and until it's perceived as a jeweled tent, myth-woven. And to be myth-woven means that the universe carries its meaning within it. The poem Mythopoeia also celebrates human creativity in this world that has its own divine meaning within it. Although, Tolkien says, human beings have become estranged from God, they can still show forth his wisdom and truth in their own literary sub-creations. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and sow the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. The right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. And so Tolkien pronounces a blessing on the legend makers whose stories help to pull people away from the flatness of materialism. In the final lines of the poem, he affirms that poets, and by extension storytellers and artists of all kind, will still create art in heaven. In paradise they look no more awry, and though they make anew, they make no lie. Be sure they still will make, not being dead. And poets shall have flames upon their head, and harps whereon their faultless fingers fall. There each shall choose forever from the all. Now he's using quite a bold image here, and poets shall have flames upon their head. It's the imagery of Pentecost, of the Holy Spirit appearing in tongues of fire on the heads of the apostles. So we can see that Mythopoeia is a passionate, poetic testament to Tolkien's belief in the meaningful quality of both God's creation and artistic subcreation. And this insight into the meaningful quality of stories, both divine enacted in history and human in literature, helps to erode Lewis's tendency to overvalue abstraction and overvalue after-the-fact conceptualizing. And this helped enable him to arrive at belief in Christ. Now there's another element of Mythopoeia that's worth noting, although it's often overlooked. We don't usually think about Tolkien as being an apologist. We think of Lewis as he becomes the great Christian apologist. But here in Mythopoeia, Tolkien is presenting a line of apologetics argument for Christianity that surely had an impact on Lewis at this early stage in Lewis's spiritual development. In the poem, he addresses the objection that Christianity is nothing more than a wish fulfillment story. First, he observes, the heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise and still recalls him. And this is the concept of natural theology, summed up in Romans chapter 1. Second, Tolkien asks, if we entertain wish fulfillment dreams, where did we get the power to wish or dream in the first place? The answer? Because we are created. Genesis chapters 1 through 3. And the power to create, to even to have these dreams, is a pointer to the fact that human beings have a creator who is personal and creative. As he says, we make still by the law in which we're made. And third, Tolkien notes that wish fulfillment dreams require us to distinguish between the fair and the ugly. The ability to judge something as good or true or beautiful, and other things as evil, false, and ugly, depends on the existence of objective value, a reality that individual people can access that is independent of themselves. In short, we're created with a conscience, Romans chapter 2. Yes, wish fulfillment dreams we spin to cheat our timid hearts and ugly fact defeat. Whence came the wish, and whence the power to dream? Were some things fair and others ugly deem? All wishes are not idle, nor in vain fulfillment we devise, for pain is pain, not for itself to be desired, but ill. Or else to strive or to subdue the will alike were graceless, and of evil this alone is dreadly certain, evil is. Now we can see something of the effect of Tolkien's argument on Lewis by looking at a poem that Lewis himself wrote, What the Bird Said Early in the Year. Fittingly, it's now inscribed on a plaque in Addison's Walk. And in this poem, Lewis declares that he will escape the circular trap, the circular flat trap of modernity and materialist thinking. Lewis writes, I heard in Addison's Walk a bird sing clear. This year, the summer will come true. This year, this year. Winds will not strip the blossom from the apple trees this year, nor want of rain destroy the peas. This year, time's nature will no more defeat you, nor all the promised moments in their passing cheat you. This time, they will not lead you round and back to autumn, 1 year older by the well-worn track. This year, as all these flowers foretell, we shall escape the circle and undo the spell. Often deceived, yet open once again your heart. Quick, 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 the gates are drawn apart. A new life in a larger, freer world will be entered upon as the imprisoning gates of doubt are drawn apart. So we've seen that Tolkien was a significant influence on Lewis's conversion to Christianity and also shaping some of his ideas about the faith. But it was not a one-way influence. Lewis, in turn, had an important impact on Tolkien's spiritual life. When the two first met in 1926, Tolkien was at a low ebb in his religious life. He had diligently practiced his faith through the Great War, where he fought in the trenches in the First World War. But after he was demobilized and had taken up a job teaching at Leeds University in the north of England, he entered into a time of spiritual difficulty. For a stretch, Tolkien wrote many years later, he had almost ceased to practice my religion. Now, we don't know how long a time this was, but it was several years at the least. It might have been as long as 10 years. But around 1930, by Tolkien's own reckoning, he began once more fully to practice his faith. As with the onset of this time of spiritual dryness, we don't know exactly what brought about the end, but one of the factors involved in the renewal of his faith was certainly his friendship with Lewis. It seems very probable that the discussions and lively disagreements with his non-Christian friend over the next few years contributed to the gradual revitalization of Tolkien's own spiritual health. Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another, as Proverbs 27 puts it. In explaining Christianity to an intelligent, thoughtful friend and colleague who would have actively challenged him, why do you believe that? Tolkien would have found himself compelled to think more deeply about his own beliefs. What did he believe and why? Around the same time that he was composing the poem Mythopoeia, Tolkien wrote in his diary that not only did he enjoy Lewis's friendship, but it has done me much good from the contact with a man at once honest, brave, intellectual, and a lover, at least after a long pilgrimage of our Lord. The spiritual refreshment that Lewis provided to Tolkien continued through the years. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Lewis and Tolkien met frequently at Inklings meetings and just to socialize themselves, going on the occasional walking tour together and encouraging each other in their fiction writing. Tolkien found these occasions so spiritually helpful that he became alert to the surprising number of obstacles that seemed to arise when they planned to get together. Jokingly, he said, "A minor imp of Slubgob's brood specially attends to preventing C.S. Lewis and myself from meeting." And this is a reference to Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters, which is dedicated to Tolkien. It's a satire, a fictional correspondence between a senior devil, Screwtape, giving advice to a junior devil, Slubgob, Wormwood. And Slubgob is another devil in charge of the Tempter's training college. And this book's upside-down perspective allows Lewis to shed a lot of light on the Christian life. Now, as an Englishman, Tolkien would have avoided being over-earnest in directly saying how much he enjoyed and benefited and valued Lewis's companionship, but by making it into a humorous reference to the Screwtape Letters, he could say what he meant, that Lewis's friendship was a real help to his life as a Christian. Lewis's influence goes further. Just as Tolkien had helped Lewis to grasp the meaning of Christianity as the myth made fact, so too, some years later, Lewis helped Tolkien to work through some difficulties with understanding the relationship of the Bible to history. One of the challenges for the church in Tolkien's lifetime was how to respond to modern developments in textual criticism as applied to biblical scholarship. New methods of critical analysis had been adopted, affecting how people, both academics and ordinary worshipers, related to the Bible. Now, these new methods provided insight into historical context and authorship, and they allowed for better editions of the Bible. But they were also taken up in a general cultural shift towards theological modernism. There was an increasing perception that science had disproved the inspiration and accuracy of the Bible, and that only the gullible and uneducated could continue to believe in it as the church had traditionally taught it. Tolkien observed this shift with regard to the Genesis accounts of the Garden of Eden, remarking in 1945 that some Christians had rejected the whole story, he says, as soon as modern taste began to sneer. And that even among those who had not abandoned it, many of them, he said, sort of tucked Genesis into a lumber room of their mind. It is not very fashionable furniture. A bit ashamed to have it about the house, don't you know, when the bright, clever young people called. And the problem was that if the Bible is nothing more than an ancient myth, it could not be an authoritative sacred text. But if affirming its divine inspiration meant rejecting the mythic dimension entirely and reading it on a flatly literal level, much was lost. Tolkien had evidently wrestled with this very issue, for he noted, "I do not now feel either ashamed or dubious on the Eden myth." Not now, but at some earlier point he had been among those who felt a bit ashamed of it and had consequently, as he put it, forgotten the beauty of the matter even as a story. How had he come to terms with the Garden of Eden? Tolkien explained that while the New Testament contains virtually contemporary documents, the book of Genesis is, he said, separated by we do not know how many sad exiled generations from the fall. But, he adds, certainly there was an Eden on this very unhappy earth, which the human spirit somehow recalls. Tolkien identified three influences that shaped his deeper appreciation of the Genesis account. The first was his own literary and linguistic work, which had helped him to convince the not yet Christian Lewis that a myth can also be true. Another influence was, as he put it, the firm guiding hand of Alma Mater Ecclesia, that is, our mother, the church. And he probably had in mind the encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu on the reading and study of Holy Scripture. And in this encyclical, Pope Pius XII declared that Catholics should produce new editions of the Scriptures that unite the greatest reverence for the sacred text with an exact observance of all the rules of criticism, and explained that it was vitally important to identify the literary mode of a given scriptural text, as well as to understand the customary modes of expression and narration peculiar to the ancients. And a third influence that Tolkien identifies was an essay written by the now converted Lewis that made a defense of the story value of Christianity. The essay in question was probably myth became fact, and it was much indebted to the insights that Lewis had received from Tolkien and Dyson in their nighttime conversation at Addison's Walk. Lewis, now returning the favor, now enabled Tolkien to see more clearly that although a story's beauty was not necessarily a guarantee of its truth, it was, he said, a concomitant of it. And the faithful are meant to draw nourishment from the beauty as well as the truth. And this seems to have helped Tolkien to develop a new and deeper reading of the story of Eden. So we've seen that Tolkien helped Lewis to become a Christian and to develop the full, rich understanding of Christianity as the true myth. And he presented Lewis with a poetic argument for natural theology, the reality of objective value, and the theological grounding of human creativity. And in turn, Lewis helped Tolkien to strengthen and grow in his own faith and to come later on to a better understanding of the Bible. Their friendship didn't mean pretending that they had no religious differences or that these differences were unimportant. It was based on the recognition that what they shared was real and substantial and important and could be helpful for each of them to share with each other. And it was based on a deliberate effort on both sides to distinguish between prejudice and disagreement. If it were not for their friendship, Lewis might have become a Christian, but probably not at that point in his life. And so we probably do owe to Tolkien the existence of works like Mere Christianity and the Chronicles of Narnia. Tolkien encouraged Lewis's literary work in more specific ways as well. Although he didn't enjoy everything that Lewis wrote, he thought very highly of the Ransom trilogy and helped to get Out of the Silent Planet published. And we certainly owe to Lewis the existence of Tolkien's magnum opus, The Lord of the Rings. As Lewis remarked in the letter, my continual encouragement, carried to the point of nagging, influenced him very much to write at all with that gravity and at that length. And Tolkien himself acknowledged the unpayable debt that he owed to Lewis for his sheer encouragement. As he put it, he was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. So I believe that we have much to be grateful for Tolkien and Lewis's friendship, for their faith, and for their mutual influence. Thank you. So now let us have questions.
Right, so just make sure to wait to start your question until the microphone gets to you. And now the hands rise shooting up.
And it can be about this, or I do have this book that Father Isaac mentioned, yes, so just written. So all that's obviously very fresh in my mind, and this material came from it. So if you have broader questions about Tolkien's faith, happy to address those as well. Or about Lewis, although if I don't know, I won't talk. Come on, students, you can't let your professors have all the credit here for good questions. Excellent. Brave soul. I don't bite.
Hello. Ooh. Thank you for being here. I am just about to finish the Chronicles of Narnia series, and I was wondering if you had a favorite and why.
Marvelous series. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which, as you know, if you read them in the proper order for the first time, is the first book. That always has a special place because that's where we meet Aslan for the first time. We meet Narnia for the first time. But I think of the series, I think my personal favorite is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And you know, why is it my favorite? I mean, I read these as a little girl, and I think there's just something exciting about the voyage and this sense of adventure, and it's such vivid images and such interesting images, like the island where dreams come true, and the idea, like, no, just dreams in general, not just happy dreams, but any dreams, and they think about that, like, okay, that's actually quite disturbing and creepy, no wonder they don't want to stay there. So it's very, I think that sort of epic voyage, just really compelling. And then it was neat, obviously years after I knew them as a girl, I read Michael Ward's book, Planet Narnia, which I think if you're having the class with Father Isaac, you're knowing about. And that helped me see even more, like, wow, this has got this amazing imagery in it, solar imagery in the Dawn Treader, which, okay, that's probably part of why I've liked it so much. So if you haven't read that book, highly, highly recommend it. Good. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming. So you mentioned sort of a bit of Tolkien's religious history, which was prior to his meeting with C.S. Lewis, he was sort of drifting away from the Catholic faith. Do you think the sort of attempts that a lot of World War I veterans went through to reconcile their faith with the horrors that they had seen, especially in Tolkien's case in the Battle of the Somme, do you think any of those sort of internal conversations may have attributed to his sort of partial drift away from the Catholic faith?
Great question. So first, let me sort of elaborate a little bit on when Tolkien says, I almost ceased to practice my religion. He actually has that statement in the context of explaining that he always felt very strongly the love of God, and that he just felt that he wasn't living up to it. So I think it's important to note that as far as we can tell, he never lost his faith, but he stopped practicing his faith. And of course, if you stop practicing your faith, eventually that can corrode your belief itself. But Tolkien, he's aware that he had kind of lapsed in his practice. What did that mean exactly? We don't know exactly, but I would imagine from the kinds of things that he said, probably wasn't going to Mass when he should, probably was skipping Sunday obligation, not going to confession, probably his prayer life was really kind of dry. So he's not practicing his faith very much. So how did that relate to his war experience? I think it does relate, but not in the way that we might think. It was very interesting, and I talk about this a lot more in Tolkien's faith. Going into the war, he had actually already really grappled with the question of evil and suffering at a very personal level. He lost both of his parents by the time he was 12. Catholic teaching at that time also tended to be a bit more forthright in examining the question of suffering. So Catholics coming into the war typically had already kind of wrestled with these issues more than their Anglican compatriots. And that was actually part of the reason that members of the Church of England often had a harder time with their faith than their Catholic fellow soldiers. What probably contributed to this ebb in his faith and the practice of his faith afterwards is probably not so much the theological issues, but rather the change of practices. Because as a soldier in the war, he'd gotten used to a very disrupted schedule. Being able to go to Mass at all, who knows when. They had dispensations. They didn't have to fast. They didn't have to have Sunday obligation. All very necessary to help soldiers get through their lives. It was interesting. A Catholic chaplain of the time in 1919 wrote, I think some of our soldiers may have a hard time when they return trying to get back into the regular practice of their faith. And I think that's probably what happened with Tolkien, that his life he had practiced his faith, but it had been so disrupted by the war that when he got back to regular life, he didn't know how to do it. And possibly the trauma of the war did have something to do with that as well. Wouldn't be surprising. A lot of things coming together that kind of brought him to a low ebb. Yeah, it's a good question. There's lots of factors that can create that low ebb. And I think it helps us to relate better to Tolkien in a way, to know that he did go through that and came up out of it in the end. Yeah, good. Another question where the mic go. Yes.
This is loud. I've often heard that Tolkien didn't like the Chronicles of Narnia, and you seem to say in your preamble that that was not true or an exaggeration. Could you say more about that?
I was hoping for that question. So what did Tolkien think about Narnia? That's a big topic, but in brief, he didn't care for the stories. He didn't enjoy them. They weren't to his taste. Okay, that's fine. But it's often said his first biographer, authorized biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, very misleadingly and incorrectly says that he detested them, and that's not the case at all. He heard Lewis read aloud to him the first couple of chapters of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Just the first couple of chapters, heard them read to him. Just a bit, we get up to Mr. Tumnus and Mr. Tumnus inviting Lucy for tea. And he really was not impressed. And he said to another friend, well, this just won't do. This is, what's all this about? And that particular derogatory remark had to do specifically with those first couple of chapters that he heard in isolation. That has been taken incorrectly to apply to his whole view of the Narnia Chronicles. But it was specifically about that first bit. And I think it's very comprehensible. It's something I talk about in my other Tolkien book, Tolkien Water Reading. Because remember, we now know that Mr. Tumnus turns out to be a good guy, right? He repents, he doesn't actually turn Lucy over to the White Witch. We have to remember that fauns in Greek mythology are rapists, to put that bluntly. So Tolkien has just heard a children's story in which you have a faun taking a little girl to his house, and there's like a book on the shelf that's the love life of fauns. And I think Tolkien's like, come on, Jack, what are you playing at? There's a little bit of innuendo here, which is not appropriate. Remember, Tolkien had a daughter. So I just think Tolkien's like, what the heck? and I think, and we don't have the drafts of The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe because Lewis didn't keep his drafts, but some of the kind of risque book titles that Tolkien names don't appear in the final version. So I can't prove this because we don't have the draft, but I wouldn't be surprised if Lewis realized, oh, actually, that is a little off, and edited it. And of course, now we know that the story unfolds as it does, but Tolkien didn't know that when he made that comment. He makes later on other comments that he felt that they were a bit of a hodgepodge. It's too bad. He should have read Michael Ward's Plan of Narnia. He would have seen the underlying themes. If he didn't recognize the coherence of it, he only saw the mix of elements, which to Tolkien, who obsessive would be the right word about consistency. So it wasn't his thing. But it's very important to note later in life, he wrote to a correspondent, he said, I am glad you've discovered the Chronicles of Narnia. And he calls them deservedly very popular. And he also kept a set of the Narnia Chronicles on his bookshelves for his grandchildren to read when they came to visit. And he was very attentive to his grandchildren's reading. So that was his endorsement, basically. So he personally didn't care for them, but the idea that he hated them has just been overblown and is just simply not the case. So I'm glad to be kind of putting a stake in the heart of that particular urban myth. Right, question, yes?
I don't know. Yeah, good. Thank you for your talk. My question concerns, I guess, the element where you spoke about the place in paradise of the poet with the flame and the inspiration. And the question I have is, did Lewis or Tolkien ever look at the impact of their professional work as literary scholars, as literary critics, particularly as medievalists, and how did that aspect of their life, that professional aspect of their life, impact their faith? Did they ever speak about it?
Not that I know of. Sorry.
Because it's kind of the flip side in a way, right? There's the sort of the creative work that one does as a writer of fiction, but obviously the work that they did as scholars informs that work.
And I think, I mean, there is a connection. Actually, why don't we get the mic ready for the next question? I think there is a connection. Neither of them, well, Lewis speaks probably about this somewhere. He wrote many more essays than Tolkien did. Tolkien doesn't specifically address this anywhere because Tolkien he just doesn't directly comment on that. But we do find throughout his academic work references to, his understanding of the faith has definitely enhanced his ability to do the literary criticism. And I think his understanding of how to do literary criticism, as I alluded to in my talk, influenced his ability to read the Bible. So I think there is a back and forth there, being able to tease out exactly what it was. Now, most specifically, I think Tolkien's love of language is connected to his faith at a very deep level. And one of his students, Simon Dardan, actually connects it directly to the prologue of the Gospel of John, that this love of the word was at the heart of Tolkien's own love of words, of languages. So I don't think any of them specifically, they didn't address that specific thing, but I think there definitely is a fruitful connection between their academic work and their faith. All right, another question? Yes, over here.
Hi. So I was curious, I know you mentioned it a bit in your introduction about what brought you to examine this friendship closer, but I can see that you have a very vast depth of knowledge about their friendship and their individual lives, and I want to know what initially struck you to want to go deeper and to explore that further.
Oh, good question. I mean, I've been reading both of these authors pretty much my entire life. So I had no idea they were friends when I first loved their work. I just knew that they both wrote these awesome fantasy stories. And I don't even know when I think I might have been in graduate school, even, or certainly college, when I realized that, my two favorite authors knew each other? What, they were friends? Cool. So this has always kind of been something that interests me because I'm interested in fantasy literature. And so the fact they both wrote fantasy, it's kind of been sort of in parallel. So I became interested specifically in Tolkien's friendship with Lewis when I was writing my previous Tolkien book, Tolkien's Wonder Reading, because I wanted to know, what, did Tolkien enjoy? How many of Lewis's books did Tolkien enjoy? Lots of them, as it turns out, more than you might think. And then realizing, in the course of that research, working out what did he really think about Narnia, as I just answered my previous question, and then in writing this book, delving into it because I wanted to know, okay, I'm trying to unpack Tolkien's faith. Clearly, Lewis has a really big impact on it. So there wasn't sort of one thing that made me say I want to look at this, but it was more like lots of little threads that have kind of been interwoven into the fabric. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering to what extent you thought Tolkien and Lewis felt it was necessary not to mention the Gospels directly in their works, because you mentioned the myths being different than allegories, not being as obvious. But I know I've read both The Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia and didn't know that until later on. I don't know what you thought about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And of course, part of it, try to make a reasonably concise answer. Allegory is a very specific literary device. We tend in the modern day to use allegory a little bit sort of too broadly to mean anything that we can interpret in a Christian way. Allegory is very specific, this equals that through the whole story. So George Orwell's Animal Farm is an allegory about totalitarianism. Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress is an allegory about the Christian life. The Chronicles of Narnia are not allegories because there's not a one-to-one correspondence between this is Jesus doing this and this and this. Now there are definitely points where they overlap. Like there's the resurrection. There's the death and resurrection of Christ in Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. But the whole book is not like an allegory of the Gospels. They're what Lewis calls supposals, in which he's imagining Aslan. What would Jesus be like if he became incarnate in another world? So that's not an allegory. But Lewis did write an allegory, Pilgrim's Regress. He could use allegory and wanted to. Tolkien likewise could. Tolkien used it less than Lewis. There's a great story by Tolkien called Leaf by Niggle, and it's about purgatory. Fantastic story. Really, really compelling. It's also about creativity and about art, and it's a great story. So, to come back to your question, Tolkien preferred to do his expression of Christianity more under the radar. And I talk about this more in Tolkien's faith. He definitely had a sense that he was grounded in his faith. He calls The Lord of the Rings a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, but he's quite keen to keep it sort of submerged. And I think that is part of its effectiveness, is that it is able to gauge a lot of people who, have no idea that it has any Christian elements. But it's operating in a different way. Lewis tended to be more deliberate. He wanted people to recognize the Christian elements. He didn't want them to be totally in your face, but he wanted people to recognize that Aslan is Christ. And that's why he even puts in pointers in the Narnia Chronicles, like, well, he has a different name in your world, that kind of thing. So that's just a different mode of approach. Lewis felt more comfortable with a more direct approach. But then both of them, when it was appropriate, could be speaking quite directly. I mean, obviously Lewis does a lot of his direct apologetics. Amazing work. Tolkien never felt that was kind of his thing. He felt like, let's leave theology to the theologians. He just didn't feel comfortable doing that. But if you read his essay on fairy stories, fantastic essay, epilogue to it, he kind of breaks out into a presentation of the gospel. It's the only thing you can call it. He talks about the happy ending of what fairy stories is actually being connected to the incarnation and resurrection of Christ. And so even Tolkien could at times bring out an explicit argument for, look, this is the story that really happened. This is the gospel, in the right place at the right time. So I think each of them had their preferred modes. Lewis a little bit more overt, Tolkien a little bit more implicit, but they chose it depending on the genre and the form that they felt suited. Yeah. Good. Let's see, who has got Mike over here? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. The short version of this question is just to ask you to expand a little bit upon what Tolkien and Lewis meant by myth. And the kind of, I guess, part of where I come at this question is in teaching scriptural exegesis here at Providence College. Right, that phrase would be just totally anathema to any of the early Christian fathers. Right, myth is the exact opposite of what the scriptures are, and I wonder the extent to which Tolkien and Lewis's the freedom with which they appropriate this language is shaped by. Francis Thompson's line about, Keats being the one who made Aphrodite beautiful, in the sense that there's already something kind of maybe it's the Oxford connection, maybe it's broadly 19th century romantic kind of insights, but like what enabled them to feel so comfortable with the language of myth rather than maybe something a little more benign like narrative? So
that's a great question. I will attempt not to give you an entire hour's lecture in answering it. It's interesting that you mentioned Francis Thompson because Tolkien considered Francis Thompson to be among the greatest of all poets, he called him. So it is, maybe someone could write an essay on this. It's possible that had an influence on Tolkien. I don't know, but I know that he had Thompson's collected poems. Okay, now I do think part of the question is just, what does the word myth mean? And that's always very difficult to give a presentation like this because when I talk about, Christianity being a myth. Like, I want to put all these caveats, but they recognize that it was true. It's the true myth. And I think the most important thing is that language shifts, language changes. And you're absolutely right that the early Christian fathers would not have used myth in that way. But if you look, if you've read, for instance, Lewis's Studies in Words, he also wouldn't have used the word nature in the same way. Or lots of words just change their meaning. So what word could we use now that will convey these things? Now, narrative won't do it because narrative doesn't convey all that myth conveys. So the concept of that for which they're using myth, story is close to myth, but not quite the same. The word myth, as Lewis and Tolkien are using it, is a story that is resonant of meaning, that evokes meaning beyond itself, and that you have a response to it, that is deeper than just sort of the events of the story. Now, both Lewis and Tolkien, and I think Tolkien possibly more explicitly, well, both of them, would say that the reason that a powerful myth moves us in that way is that it's connected to reality. And so, for instance, this is exactly what Tolkien talks about in the epilogue on fairy stories. Why does a happy ending move us? Even if we don't believe in Christ, the reason it moves us, according to Tolkien, is that it's actually a participation in the cosmic happy ending of the resurrection. So for Lewis, why did these stories of the dying and rising gods move him? Because there really is a dying and rising God. That's why the myth has that power. Now, the original pagan authors of those stories didn't know this, but and this again comes back to Tolkien's understanding, and Lewis's too, about if you're really trying to write what's true, natural theology will get you a long way. So in writing about the imagining the dying and the rising God, in a sense, these pagan poets are connecting with something that's true even though they don't know that it's true. And so it resonates. And the idea of, the resonating with a story, and there's so many myths that aren't necessarily directly religious, but the story arc of the hero's quest, for instance. It's a myth, and it resonates with us because it speaks to something about human nature and our desire to grow, that sort of thing. So that's, I think, that's why the term myth is so useful, because it's a kind of story that is often very simple on the outside, but it resonates with something powerfully true, either about human nature, like the hero's quest, or about reality, as with the dying and rising gods. And the story can itself be, the power of a myth is that the story itself can be so bare bones, and yet it still resonates. And it can be told in a variety of different ways. Star Wars is a hero's quest story, and yet it still resonates. And that's what makes myth different from just like narrative, because it resonates in that way. And that's I think why they choose that term. And no other word quite conveys that quality of the bare bones, yet it's plugged into something deeper. But that's also why they're quite careful always to return to, okay, Christianity is a myth in the sense that it is a story that resonates with us at our deepest level, and indeed resonates with people even if they don't believe it happened. That's a key quality of myth. But Tolkien and Lewis are both very clear, it is also a thing that happened. As Tolkien says in the epilogue on fairy stories, legend has entered history. This is the greatest of all fairy stories, and it is true. And so that, for them, is the way that these two things come together. I hope that helps answer the question.
Let's give a warm round of applause for Professor Ordway. Join us down the hall.